You think you know Emperor Nero, right? The crazy Roman emperor who played his fiddle while Rome burned? Well, buckle up, because the real Nero was so much worse than any Hollywood movie dares to show you. We're talking about a man who murdered his own mother not once, but twice when the first attempt failed. A ruler so twisted that he castrated a male slave and married him in a public ceremony. An emperor whose paranoia was so extreme that he turned the entire Roman Empire into his personal torture chamber. You're about to discover the shocking truths about Nero that make Game of Thrones look like a Disney fairy tale. From his bizarre sexual obsessions to his systematic persecution of Christians, from the brutal murder of his pregnant wife to the grotesque waste of an empire's wealth while citizens starved. These are the facts that will change everything you thought you knew about Rome's most infamous ruler. You don't learn this in school, but Nero wasn't just crazy. He was a calculated psychopath who turned cruelty into an art form. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never think of ancient Rome the same way again. This isn't just history. This is horror with a crown. Fact number 1. The mother murder plot. Let's start with the most shocking truth about Emperor Nero. He literally tried to kill his own mother twice because once wasn't enough for this maniac. We're talking about Agrippina, the woman who put him on the throne. And Nero's response was to orchestrate one of the most elaborate murder plots in ancient history. First, he tried to drown her. Nero had his engineers build a special collapsible boat designed to fall apart in the middle of the sea. Picture this. He invited his mother for a lovely evening cruise, then watched from the shore as the boat literally broke in half. But here's where it gets absolutely incredible. Agrippina was such a tough woman that she swam to shore and survived the assassination attempt. Most people would give up at this point, right? Not Nero. When the drowning plan failed, he sent soldiers to her house and had them stab her to death. But wait, it gets worse. According to historical accounts, when the soldiers hesitated, Agrippina pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here, for this is what bore Nero." She literally told them where to stab her, because she knew her son was behind it all. Modern experts believe this murder was Nero's way of eliminating the one person who could challenge his absolute power. His own mother had become too influential, too controlling, and Nero's solution was cold-blooded matricide. This is the same guy who claimed the gods chose him to rule Rome. The Roman people were so horrified by this mother murder that many refused to believe it actually happened. They couldn't imagine that even Nero could be that twisted. They were very, very wrong. Fact number 2. Rome burns while Nero plays. Everyone's heard that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, but the reality of what happened during the Great Fire of 64 AD was so much more disturbing than any fiddle-playing legend. We're talking about a disaster that consumed 2/3 of Rome while the emperor treated it like personal entertainment. The fire burned for 6 days and 7 nights, destroying 10 of Rome's 14 districts. Thousands of people died in the flames, and hundreds of thousands lost everything they owned. Ancient historians describe scenes of complete chaos, families running through smoke-filled streets carrying whatever they could save. Children separated from parents in the panic, entire neighborhoods vanishing in hours. And what was Nero doing during this catastrophe? Multiple historical sources report that he climbed to a high tower, dressed in his stage costume, and performed songs about the destruction of Troy while watching his capital city burn. Imagine being so narcissistic that you turn a national tragedy into your personal concert. But here's the truly horrifying part. Many Romans believed Nero started the fire himself. Why? Because immediately after the disaster, he seized the burned land to build his massive Golden House palace. This wasn't just opportunistic, it was calculated. Nero literally profited from his people's suffering by using the cleared land for his own luxury projects. You don't learn this in history classes, but the fire destroyed Rome's greatest libraries, temples, and artworks that had survived for centuries. Cultural treasures that could never be replaced went up in smoke while Nero sang about fictional destruction. The man was so detached from reality that he confused real tragedy with theatrical performance. But that's nothing compared to how he treated the people he blamed for the fire. Fact number 3. The Christian Holocaust. After the Great Fire nearly destroyed Rome, Nero needed someone to blame. And he chose the perfect scapegoats, a small, weird religious group called Christians. What happened next was one of history's first systematic genocides, and the details are absolutely horrifying. Nero didn't just execute Christians. He turned their deaths into public entertainment spectacles that would make modern horror movies look tame. He had Christians sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs who would tear them apart while crowds cheered. Others were crucified along the roads leading into Rome, creating miles of dying people on crosses as a warning to anyone who opposed the emperor. But here's where Nero's creativity for cruelty really showed. He used Christians as human torches to light his garden parties. These people were covered in pitch and oil, tied to poles, and set on fire to provide lighting for Nero's evening entertainment. Imagine being so twisted that you use burning human beings as decorative lighting for your dinner parties. The persecution was so brutal that even Romans who hated Christians started feeling sorry for them. Historical accounts describe how Nero would walk through his gardens at night, enjoying conversations with guests while Christians burned alive just a few feet away, their screams mixing with the sound of laughter and music. Modern historians estimate that thousands of Christians died during Nero's persecution. Men, women, and children were tortured to death simply for their religious beliefs, while Nero treated their suffering like a form of artistic expression. He actually believed he was creating beautiful spectacles of death and pain. This is the same emperor who claimed to be a patron of the arts and culture. His idea of culture was literally watching people burn alive for his personal amusement. Fact number 4. The wife murder. You think domestic violence is bad today? Wait until you hear what Emperor Nero did to his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina. This wasn't just spousal abuse. This was an act so shocking that it horrified even Romans who were used to extreme violence. Poppaea was Nero's second wife, and by all accounts, he was obsessed with her. She was considered one of the most beautiful women in Rome, and Nero had actually stolen her from her previous husband. But Nero's love was possessive and violent, and Poppaea learned this the hard way. In 65 AD, Poppaea was pregnant with their second child when she and Nero got into an argument. Historical sources don't agree on what they were fighting about. Some say she complained about him coming home late from the races. Others say she criticized his performance skills. But what happened next is recorded by multiple historians. Nero flew into such a rage that he literally kicked his pregnant wife to death. We're talking about a man who killed his unborn child and his wife in a single moment of fury. Roman historian Tacitus describes how Poppaea collapsed from the beating and died shortly afterward, probably from internal injuries caused by Nero's kicks to her pregnant belly. Here's something that will blow your mind. After murdering Poppaea, Nero was so devastated by her death that he tried to find ways to bring her back. He searched the entire empire for women who looked like her and forced them to pretend to be Poppaea. When that didn't work, He found a young man who resembled her and, well, that leads us to our next shocking fact. But even Romans who were used to imperial violence were disturbed by a man who would kill his own pregnant wife in a fit of rage. Fact number 5. The bizarre marriage. After murdering his pregnant wife, Nero's grief took the most twisted turn imaginable. He became obsessed with recreating Pompeii, and his solution was so bizarre that even Romans, who had seen everything, were completely shocked. Nero found a young male slave named Sporus, who apparently resembled his dead wife. But Nero didn't just want Sporus to pretend to be Pompeii. He wanted to literally transform him into her. So he ordered doctors to castrate Sporus and then married him in a full public ceremony, complete with wedding dress, dowry, and all the traditional Roman marriage rituals. Think about how insane this was. We're talking about the most powerful man in the world forcing a slave to undergo surgical mutilation and then treating him like his dead wife. Sporus had to dress as a woman, act like Pompeii, and probably endure whatever psychological games Nero played to maintain his fantasy. But here's the truly horrifying part. This wasn't done in private. Nero paraded Sporus around Rome as his wife, bringing him to public events and expecting Roman citizens to treat this castrated slave as their empress. Roman historian Dio Cassius wrote that people didn't know whether to laugh or cry when they saw the emperor with his fake wife. The marriage lasted for years. Sporus was trapped in this nightmare relationship where he had to pretend to be a dead woman to satisfy the emperor's grief and obsession. Modern psychologists would probably classify Nero's behavior as a severe psychological disorder involving trauma, control, and sexual dysfunction. You don't learn this in history classes, but after Nero's death, Sporus was passed around like property to Nero's successors until he finally committed suicide to escape the continuing abuse. One person's twisted grief destroyed multiple lives and traumatized an entire empire. And this was just how Nero dealt with personal relationships. Wait until you see what he did with Rome's money. Fact number 6, the Golden Madness. While ordinary Romans were starving and living in poverty, Emperor Nero was spending the empire's wealth on luxuries so extreme they make modern billionaires look modest. We're talking about waste on a scale that literally drained one of history's greatest empires just to feed one man's ego. Nero's Golden House was the most expensive building project in ancient history. This wasn't just a palace. It was a 300-acre complex that covered about 1/3 of Rome. The walls were covered in gold leaf. The ceilings had rotating sections that dropped flower petals and perfume on guests, and there was an artificial lake the size of a small sea inside the building. But here's where the waste gets absolutely incredible. Nero had a 120-foot-tall bronze statue of himself built in the palace courtyard. To put that in perspective, that's taller than the Statue of Liberty without its pedestal. Imagine being so narcissistic that you build a statue of yourself that can be seen from miles away. The dining rooms had ivory ceilings with panels that could slide open to shower guests with flowers and perfumes. One banquet hall had a dome that rotated constantly to mimic the movement of the heavens. These weren't just rooms. They were elaborate mechanical theaters designed to impress visitors with Nero's wealth and power. Meanwhile, regular Romans were paying crushing taxes to fund these projects. Families were selling themselves into slavery just to pay the imperial tax collectors, while Nero hosted dinner parties that cost more than most people would see in multiple lifetimes. Historical accounts describe feasts where single meals cost enough to feed a small city for months. Modern economists estimate that Nero's building projects and lifestyle consumed roughly 60% of the empire's annual revenue. He was literally bankrupting Rome to fund his personal fantasies while his people suffered. This is the same emperor who claimed to care about Roman citizens. But even unlimited wealth couldn't protect Nero from his own paranoia. Fact number 7, the paranoid executioner. By his final years, Nero had become so paranoid that he turned the entire Roman Empire into a surveillance state where anyone could be executed for the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. We're talking about systematic terror that made Stalin's purges look restrained. Nero saw enemies everywhere. Poets who wrote verses he didn't like were executed for hidden meanings in their work. Senators who asked questions during meetings were killed for plotting against him. Even people who looked sad in his presence could be charged with treason for not showing proper enthusiasm for their emperor. The executions became a daily routine. Nero would start his mornings by reviewing lists of people to kill, often choosing victims based on dreams he'd had or random suspicions that popped into his head. Roman historian Suetonius wrote that Nero once had a man executed because he dreamed the guy was planning to poison him. But here's the truly horrifying part. Nero didn't just kill suspected enemies quickly. He turned executions into elaborate torture sessions where victims were forced to confess to crimes they never committed. People would be stretched on racks, burned with hot irons, or thrown to wild animals while crowds watched for entertainment. The paranoia got so extreme that Nero started executing his own friends and advisors. Nobody was safe. Not his closest companions, not his military commanders, not even his personal servants. Court life became a nightmare where saying the wrong word or making the wrong facial expression could literally get you killed. You don't learn this in history classes, but Nero's reign of terror was so brutal that Roman citizens started fleeing to other parts of the empire just to escape his attention. The man had turned Rome from the center of civilization into a city of fear where everyone lived in constant terror of their own emperor. Eventually, even Nero's own supporters had enough of the madness. Fact number 8. The coward's end. After 14 years of murder, waste, and paranoia, Nero's reign finally came to an end. But even his death was a perfect example of his cowardice and self-obsession. When revolts broke out across the empire and his own guards abandoned him, Nero's response was exactly what you'd expect from history's most narcissistic emperor. Instead of fighting like a warrior or accepting responsibility like a leader, Nero ran away and hid in a servant's house outside Rome. But even while facing death, he couldn't stop being dramatic. Historical accounts describe him practicing different ways to kill himself while crying about how the world was losing such a great artist. The revolts weren't just political, they were personal. Roman citizens, senators, and military commanders had finally had enough of watching their empire destroyed by one man's madness. Provinces across the empire declared independence, and Nero's own Praetorian Guard joined the rebellion against him. When Nero realized he had no escape, he grabbed a dagger but was too cowardly to actually stab himself. Instead, he made his secretary do it, while Nero cried his famous last words, "What an artist dies in me." Even in his final moments, he was more concerned about his artistic reputation than the millions of people he'd killed and tortured. But here's something that will blow your mind. After Nero's death, some Romans actually missed him. Not because he was a good emperor, but because the chaos that followed was almost as bad as Nero himself. It took years for the empire to recover from the damage he'd caused in just 14 years of rule. Modern historians estimate that Nero's reign resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths through executions, persecutions, fires, and revolts. He literally turned one of history's greatest civilizations into a nightmare state ruled by fear, paranoia, and cruelty. This is what happens when unlimited power meets complete moral corruption. So there you have it, the real Emperor Nero. A mother-murdering, wife-killing, Christian-burning psychopath whose idea of entertainment was watching people die in agony. A man so twisted that he castrated a slave to replace his dead wife, so paranoid that he executed people for their dreams, and so narcissistic that his last words were about his artistic talents while his empire burned around him. These disturbing historical facts show us that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it creates monsters. Nero had every advantage in life: unlimited wealth, absolute authority, and the greatest empire in history. His response was to turn it all into a horror show that traumatized millions of people and nearly destroyed Roman civilization.